Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, I'm going to share a few thoughts about Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. This work of historical fiction was originally published in 2022. And, I decided to read this book because it's about the famous Booth family, John Wilkes Booth and his family, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. And this book actually intersects with a couple of other books I've read over the last year or so. One is Shakespeare in a Divided America. In this book, talks about Shakespeare. I chatted this here on my channel, so I will link to that chat in the details below. But it talks about Shakespeare and how the plays of Shakespeare have interacted and sort of been interwoven in American culture. And in this book, it talks about John Wilkes Booth and his famous acting family, his father, Junius Booth, and his brother, better known actor, brother Edwin Booth, from the same period. And so that was really interesting. And then this biography of General Grant as well. This General Grant obviously was the great general during the American Civil War and during the period that this book, actually the Booth book, also takes place. We also hear, get a bit about the conspiracy that surrounded the death of Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. So I was really interested, though, in Booth, the Booth family, and how this would be sort of be portrayed in this historical fiction context. Another sort of interest of mine is the fact that the Booth family lived in Maryland, which is the U.S. state in which I also live. And so just the Maryland of the time I thought would be sort of interesting to get into, and it was, So what it's about, though, it's basically about the Booth family. It starts out with the father and the mother really setting up a household in Maryland. It's not too far from Baltimore. It's a rural area, and they sort of have a secret, or it's sort of secretive, how they set up this house out there in this area, sort of a remote area, a farm. But the father is a famous actor, and so he's gone a lot of the time. The mother actually spends most of her time pregnant or giving birth or taking care of kids. She winds up having, before it's all said and done, 10 kids. 4 of them pass away in childhood, and this is really marks most of the tragedy of the earlier life of this family. But the family's fairly close. There is an older son named Junius, known as June, and then a daughter, Rosalie, and then some of the children that didn't survive, and then there's Edwin, who becomes a great Shakespearean actor, like I mentioned, another daughter, Asia, and then John Wilkes, as well as another son named Joe. And so but the story really centers around this family and the Maryland of the time. So we're talking about prior to the Civil War when the book opens, and their interaction. The father is gone on acting tours most of the time. This was one of the most interesting, I think, aspects of the book to me, was actually this picture this sort of look into what celebrity acting, or an actor, like a celebrity actor of the era, had quite a different sort of vibe than it does today, obviously, for when they had to travel on tour a lot. So they were gone a lot. And the father, though, both the father and the mother have what could be sort of, there's this stereotype, I think, sometimes of creative people and actors of being kind of like unstable, and this is really the case with especially the father. He drinks a lot. He's got maybe some mental health issues. They're very dramatic. Their whole life is sort of a drama. And so that was really sort of an interesting sort of look at sort of the theater life of the 19th century. And then later on, his sons, June and Edwin, and to some extent, John Wilkes Booth also get into the acting profession. But anyway, so the book, as the narration of the book, it sort of shifts. Based on the children mostly, as seen through the eyes of the children. So the book starts out mainly through the eyes of the daughter Rosalie. So Rosalie was, now granted, this is a historical fiction, not a history, right? So we don't know like really a lot about Rosalie. I think the author has sort of an afterword in the book where she describes really what was most fictional, and the characterization of Rosalie was one of the things that was most fictional. But Rosalie was really portrayed in this book anyway as really the caregiver of the family. So her mother, having this sort of romantic, sort of childish in a way temperament, yet always being pregnant and having children to take care of, it really, a lot of this work actually fell to Rosalie, the oldest daughter, the oldest surviving daughter, to take care of both her mother as well as her siblings. So she never marries. She wasn't as pretty as her sister Asia, and her family often refer to her as like, oh, poor Rosalie. So sort of pitiful, taking pity on her for some reason. And so the book sort of portrays her as this person who really her life gets set for her by her family, as far as having to take care of them all and having to take care of her mother in particular. But the others as well, Edwin, June, at one point is forced to go off with his father and take care of him while he's on the road acting. And what taking care of his father usually meant was actually trying to keep him from being drunk and to actually show up to the performances on time and that type of thing. So these kids are having to take this adult role with their parents. Another sort of interesting thing I think about the family, especially in this early period, was how they coped, was this slavery of Maryland. And so Maryland was, a border state between the South and the North, and so it did have slavery, but it did stay with the North. When the Civil War broke out, Maryland stayed with the Union. But there's this sort of complicated sort of relationship, I think, with the African Americans. There's a lot of freed blacks of Maryland at the time, which the Booth family were very much abolitionists. The Booth father, Junius, he was very, I guess you could say, progressive in this sense. They did employ some enslaved people, but they paid them. They not only paid the enslaver, who, for the work that the enslaved people were doing, but they also paid the actually enslaved people as well. And then they employed some free blacks as well. So John Wilkes, though, so the story doesn't revolve around him and what we know is going to happen with him eventually. It really revolves just really around this family, and really their struggle to keep it together with their very eccentric father, who is gone most of the time and also drinks a lot. We find out there's a hidden family. I won't give this away what it is, but there's a family secret that the kids don't know about. The parents, of course, when you know what the secret is, they had to know. But when it's revealed, it comes as a great shock to the children of this sort of double life that their parents were having, their father in particular, and that was just these sort of challenges that they faced. But then in the midst of all this, we have John Wilkes, who we know as the Civil War is gearing up and then it actually does break out, he is really alone in the family of being pro-Southern. So he is very pro-slavery, very pro the South. And so the rest of the family is not this way. So this dynamic really resonated today, where we have this really polarized politics where families are often split politically in today, and it can lead to some very bitter disputes among families of divisions politically. And this was occurring during this time. But John Wilkes was the only one in the family to sort of have these views. But of course, his family, they had always sort of doted on him. He had been kind of a favorite. And so they all, they don't abandon him. And then when ultimately what happens, right? He ends up killing, we don't know what's going on, really in the book, until it actually happens. And then it kind of comes as a shock to the family and to the reader, as we're seeing this through the family's eyes of what he actually, the links and how radicalized he had actually become. He thought he was killing a tyrant, apparently. And then, this is the big question of the book, is like, how do you love someone in your family that's done something so terrible? Because he didn't stop being their brother and their son. They loved him still as a member of their family. They suffer from what he did because, of course, once he killed Lincoln, the whole family gets sort of tarnished with this brush, right? And so Edwin can't work as an actor for a while. His brother June, John Wilkes' brother June, his older brother, actually gets imprisoned as was considered to be a co-conspirator for a while, as was his brother-in-law, who really didn't do anything. His sister Asia had actually let him use the house. I mean, she didn't know what was going on per se, but it was sort of like a drop-off point. So as he was doing this sort of spying for the Confederacy, as well as involved with this conspiracy to kill Lincoln, it was some of that was happening in her house. Unbeknownst to her or her husband. But anyway, the sort of wreckage that was left behind is sort of really interesting. Like, what happens to a family? The author mentioned at the end of the book, she was sort of inspired to write this book because of a mass shooting that had happened, because these happen in the U.S., all too frequently, where someone does this horrible thing and they have a family, right? They have social connections that usually it comes as a shock to, but they're impacted by what happened, by what the person does as well. Okay, I think I will stop the chat with that. I enjoyed this, this sort of look into the Booth family, just aside from the fact of their infamous family member, that just the acting family, just this look into the 19th century, this period of the 19th century and the Civil War was just so interesting. All right, I will leave the chat there. My next chat is going to be a memoir, Becoming Duchess Goldblatt by Anonymous. I have already finished this, so I will have a chat on it coming up soon. So until next time, take care.